The fire was the only warm thing left in the world. Sarah pressed her palms closer to the flames, watching the orange light dance across her skin, and tried to remember what it had felt like to be outside, to feel the sun, to breathe air that did not carry the weight of ancient stone and political ambition, and the slow, suffocating pressure of being the least important person in a room full of people who never let her forget it. The snow had started 3 days ago, not the gentle, pretty kind that dusted the mountains of Valthorn each winter and made the kingdom look like something from a painting. This snow was different. This snow had fallen in the middle of what should have been the warmest month of the year, dropping from a sky that had turned white as bone between one breath and the next, and it had not stopped since. The drifts against the outer walls of the castle were taller than the gates now. The roads were gone. The forest beyond the grounds had disappeared entirely, swallowed by a curtain of white so thick it looked like the world had simply ended somewhere beyond the tree line. No one was going anywhere. Not the nobles who had come to court for the summer solstice celebrations. Not the council members who had arrived from the northern territories with their careful smiles and their even more careful words. Not the servants, not the guards, and not Sarah, who had been here already, tucked into her small room in the east wing with her small duties and her small life, invisible as smoke. She had not intended to be in the Great Hall at all. The Great Hall was not for Omegas, not for women of her designation who existed at the lowest rung of a pack hierarchy so rigid it had been carved into the founding stones of the castle itself. The Great Hall was for alphas and betas, and the occasional high-ranking delta, who had managed to climb above their station through political maneuvering or fortunate marriage. But the east wing had lost its heat when the snow blocked the external vents, and Sarah had been given a choice between freezing quietly in her room or sharing warmth with people who considered her barely worth acknowledging. She had chosen warmth. She had wrapped herself in the plainest shawl she owned, the gray one that made her look like part of the wall, and she had slipped into the great hall through the servants' entrance and found the fireplace on the far left side, the one partially hidden behind a stone column, and she had sat down on the low bench there and made herself as small as possible. That had been 2 hours ago. In those 2 hours, she had successfully maintained her invisibility. Nobles had moved through the hall in clusters, their conversations overlapping in waves of anxiety and irritation about the unnatural storm. None of them had looked at her, and then the wolf had walked in. Sarah heard him before she saw him. Not footsteps exactly. More like a shift in the air, a cold current that moved through the warmth of the hall with a confidence that suggested it belonged there more than the fire did. She had looked up from her hands and seen the creature standing in the center archway, and her breath had simply left her body. She had heard stories about the ice wolf, of course. Everyone in Valthorn had. The bond wolf of King Kaelin Ashvile, the creature that had appeared at the king's side 3 years after his mate died. A beast that the oldest pack historians said was not a normal familiar but something older, something drawn from the bloodlines of the original Lycan ancestors. A spirit wolf that chose its companion once in a generation, and never, under any circumstances, acknowledged anyone else. The wolf was enormous. His fur was the white of fresh snow, but with a strange luminescence to it, as if light lived just beneath the surface of each individual strand. His eyes were the pale silver blue of glacier ice, and when they moved across the room, the nobles who caught that gaze physically stepped back. He moved through the hall without hurrying, without acknowledging the dozens of people who watched him in varying states of awe and wariness, and the crowd parted for him as naturally as water parts for stone. Sarah watched him with the same breathless attention as everyone else, and she told herself she was simply curious, simply another observer among observers, and that there was no reason her heart should be hammering the way it was. The wolf crossed the great hall in a slow, deliberate arc, passing the high table where the nobles had gathered, passing the council members who straightened instinctively and pressed their lips together, passing the 3 beta women who were whispering near the eastern window with their heads close together, and their eyes bright with calculation. He passed all of them. He did not look at any of them. He kept walking, paused silent on the stone floor, until he was standing directly in front of the fireplace. In front of Sarah, the world went very quiet. Not literally, because people were still murmuring and the fire was still crackling and somewhere a door was still rattling against the wind. But in the immediate circle of space around Sarah and the wolf, everything felt suspended, as if time itself was holding its breath. The wolf looked at her with those glacier eyes. Sarah looked back. She could not have said what possessed her in that moment to remain perfectly still rather than scrambling to her feet, which would have been the logical, self-preserving thing to do. But something in her was rooted. Something had gone very quiet and very certain inside her chest, and she simply held the wolf's gaze and breathed and waited. He lowered himself to the floor, not like an animal settling, not with the loose, casual sprawl of a tired creature looking for rest, with deliberateness, with intention. He arranged his enormous body at her feet, rested his great silver-white head on his forepaws, and closed his eyes. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. The entire great hall had gone still. Every conversation had died mid-sentence. Every head had turned. Every pair of eyes was fixed on the corner by the fireplace where an Omega girl in a gray shawl sat with the king's legendary, untouchable, ancient bond wolf curled at her feet like a contented house cat. Sarah felt the weight of all those gazes and did not move. She did not dare to move. She was not sure she could have if she had tried. The wolf's warmth reached her even from below. A deep, steady heat that was different from the fire's warmth. Older somehow, as if it came from a source that predated the hearth and the stone and the castle itself. She felt it move through the soles of her feet and up through her bones, and something in her that had been clenched for a very long time began, incrementally, to loosen. What is she doing? The voice came from her left, low and sharp, and carrying the particular edge of someone accustomed to having their displeasure be sufficient reason for things to change. Sarah recognized the voice before she turned to look. Isolde Vara, Beta, daughter of the Northern Council's second seat, and the most beautiful woman in Valthorn, by unanimous consensus of everyone who mattered, and several who did not. She was standing 10 feet away with her dark hair coiled at the nape of her neck and her pale green eyes fixed on Sarah with an expression that would have looked like mere curiosity to anyone who did not know how to read the specific quality of contempt that lived in the space between Isolde's brows. "She is sitting by the fire," said one of Isolde's companions, a smaller Beta woman named Petra, who always seemed to be slightly behind Isolde in both position and confidence. "What I mean," Isolde said, her voice dropping half a register in a way that was not quieter so much as more concentrated, "is what is she doing with Kale?" Kale. That was what the king called the wolf. Sarah had not known that until this moment, had only heard the creature referred to as the ice wolf, or the king's familiar in the formal way that people spoke of things they were both awed by and slightly afraid of. Hearing the name spoken aloud by Isolde felt like an intrusion, somehow. Like hearing someone say a private word out loud in a public space. "Kale does not go to anyone," Isolde continued, and now she was moving, gliding across the floor with the particular grace of a woman who had practiced the art of commanding space since childhood. "Kale has never gone to anyone. Not in 3 years. Not since the king lost his mate." Sarah kept her eyes on the fire and her hands in her lap, and her breathing slow. She felt Isolde stop a few feet away. She felt the woman's gaze on the side of her face, like a physical pressure. "You should move," Isolde said. It was not a suggestion. It was not even entirely an order. It was the kind of statement that assumed its own compliance so completely that resistance seemed structurally impossible. Sarah felt the familiar pull of that assumption, the old habit of making herself smaller, of yielding ground before the cost of holding it could be calculated. She felt it, and she recognized it, and for a reason she could not fully articulate, sitting in that particular firelight with that particular weight of warmth around. Her feet. She did not obey it. "I do not think I should," Sarah said. Her voice came out quietly, without aggression, without any of the defiance that would have been required to back up the words if this had been a different day or a different moment. She was simply stating something she understood to be true. Isolde was very still for a moment. Then, with the precision of a woman who had mastered the art of moving in ways that could not be called aggressive, but communicated threat very clearly. Nevertheless, she crouched down slightly and looked at the wolf. "Kael," she said, in a voice like warm honey poured over cold stone. "Come." The wolf did not open his eyes. He did not move a single muscle. The only evidence that he had registered the command at all was a very faint, very low sound that was not quite a growl, but occupied the same general frequency as one, felt more in the chest than heard with the ears. Isolde straightened. Something moved across her face that she smoothed away. Almost instantly, but not quite fast enough for Sarah not to catch it. It was not anger exactly. It was something more dangerous. It was recalibration. "The king will hear about this," Isolde said, and turned and walked away. The words were meant as a threat. Sarah understood that. What Isolde had not calculated, or had not yet fully processed, was that the king was already in the room. He had entered through the main doors while Isolde was speaking, moving with the particular quality of stillness that powerful men sometimes had, the ability to occupy space without announcing themselves, to be present in a room before the room fully registered their presence. He was taller than most men, not in a way that seemed designed to be intimidating, simply in the way that some trees were taller than others, with a proportionality and a rootedness that made their height feel like a natural feature of the landscape, rather than a performance. His hair was dark, close-cropped at the sides, and slightly longer at the top, and his eyes, when Sarah finally looked at him, were the exact same shade as his wolf's. That pale, clear winter sky gray that held both coldness and an enormous amount of depth simultaneously. He was watching her. Not the wolf. Not Isolde, who had gone pale the moment she registered his presence, and was now standing very straight by the eastern window with the careful blankness of someone suppressing several things at once. The king was watching Sarah. She waited for the discomfort of that gaze to arrive, the familiar crawling sensation of being looked at by someone important in a way that always felt like being assessed for some category of insufficiency. It did not come. His gaze felt different from what she had expected. It felt like the wolf's gaze, in a way she could not explain. Attentive. Measuring, yes, but not unkindly. More the way a person measures something they are genuinely trying to understand, rather than the way a person measures. Something they already know they will find wanting. He crossed the hall without hurrying. People moved out of his path without needing to be told to, and he did not seem to notice them doing it, which was either profound confidence or profound preoccupation. He stopped a few feet from the fireplace. From her. He looked down at Kael, who had opened his silver eyes and was watching his king with an expression that, if it had been on a human face, Sarah would have described as satisfied. Then the King looked at Sarah again. He said nothing for a long moment. The fire crackled between them. Kael's warmth pressed up through the floor. "He has not done that in 3 years," King Kaelin Ashvale said. His voice was lower than she expected, and slower, as if each word was chosen with the same care one might apply to stepping across uncertain ice. "I know," Sarah said. She was not sure why she admitted that, except that it was true, and he already knew it, and pretending otherwise would have been a waste of both their time. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not a smile, exactly, but it was adjacent to one, the way a word can be adjacent to the thing it describes without quite being that thing. "What is your name?" he said. "Sarah," she said. "Sarah Valin." He repeated it, not aloud, but she could see the shape of it cross his face as he processed it. And then he looked at the bench, at the small amount of space beside her that the wolf had left unoccupied. He looked at it for a moment. Then he sat down. The entire hall collectively forgot how to breathe. Sarah was fairly certain she herself had forgotten how to breathe. The King of Valthorn, the alpha of all alphas, the man whose word was law across 7 territories, and whose grief had sealed him away from human warmth for 3 years, had sat down on a servant's bench by a half-hidden fireplace, next to an Omega woman, that not a single person in the room could have named 20 minutes ago. He sat with the same quality of deliberateness that his wolf had, not casual, not stiff, simply intentional in the way that suggested he had made a decision, and the decision did not require explanation. Kyle moved his great head and rested it on the king's knee without opening his eyes, and the king's hand moved automatically to rest between the wolf's ears. And for a moment, the 3 of them existed in a quiet that felt very different from the storm howling outside the walls. "The snow is not natural," Kaelin said. It was not. Quite directed at her, not quite directed at the room. It was the way a person speaks when they are thinking aloud in the presence of someone they have decided, for reasons still forming, to trust with the sound of their thoughts. "No," Sarah agreed. "I know." He looked at her sidelong. "How do you know?" She considered the question honestly, because dishonesty in this moment felt not only pointless, but somehow wrong. A violation of the quality of silence they had built. "I have been watching the snow since it started," she said. "The way it falls is wrong. It falls in a pattern. Very small, very regular, but once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Spiral shapes, repeating. Like something is directing it rather than something that simply is." He was quiet for a moment. "You have a sharp eye," he said. "I have a great deal of time to observe things," she said. "People who are not watched tend to watch." Something in his expression shifted. Subtle but real. A fractional softening around the eyes that did not reach his mouth but did not need to. He nodded once and looked back at the fire. They sat in silence for several minutes, and the silence was comfortable in a way that Sarah had not experienced with another person in longer than she could easily recall. Outside, the wind pressed against the castle's ancient stones. Inside, the fire burned steady, and the wolf breathed slow, measured breaths, and the king's hand moved absently through the pale fur between Kael's ears, and Sarah felt, for the first time in a very long time, that she was in exactly the right place. What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below. It was Isolde who broke it. Of course it was. She had spent the last several minutes visibly recalibrating by the eastern window, her green eyes moving between Sarah and the king with the focused attention of someone solving a problem. And when she moved with the assurance of a woman who had decided that whatever calculation had produced this outcome, she possessed the variables to reverse it. She approached the fireplace with a glass of wine that she had acquired from somewhere, deep red, in a crystal glass that caught the firelight in ways that seemed almost deliberate, and she stopped just inside the natural radius of the warmth and arranged herself in a posture that managed to be both respectful toward the king and subtly, strategically appealing. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice carrying precisely the right amount of warmth and precisely the right amount of deference to communicate that she was taking nothing for granted. "Forgive the intrusion. I wanted to ensure you had everything you needed during this unexpected confinement. The council has been asking if you plan to convene a meeting about the storm." Kaelin looked at her. His expression did not change. "I plan to convene a meeting when I have something useful to tell the council," he said. "At present, I am thinking." Isolde's smile did not waver. It was a remarkable smile, Sarah noted, with the detached appreciation of someone watching a very skilled performance. It contained warmth and understanding, and the quiet promise of total reliability, and it was absolutely airtight. "Of course," Isolde said. "I apologize for disturbing your thoughts." Her gaze moved, just briefly, just fractionally, to Sarah. Just long enough to communicate everything she needed to communicate without saying anything that could be repeated as evidence. Then she glided away with her wine, and Sarah watched her go, and thought about what it meant to be a woman who had learned to use the appearance of deference as a weapon. "She does not like you," Kaelin said. Sarah blinked. She had not expected him to say it. She had not expected him to have noticed. "She does not know me," Sarah said. "She does not need to," he said. He was still watching the fire, but his jaw had shifted slightly, in a way that suggested he was not entirely relaxed. She liked the situation as it was. You have changed the situation. Sarah turned this over. Chaol changed the situation, she said. I simply did not move. People who stay still when everything in their training tells them to move, the king said quietly, are either foolish or very brave, or know something that other people do not. He finally looked at her again, and the directness of his gaze at close range was something she had not fully prepared for. It was not threatening. It was the opposite of threatening. It was the kind of gaze that saw things, that had spent years learning to look past the surface of what was presented and toward the structure underneath, and that had no particular investment in what it found, but every intention of finding it accurately. Which are you? He said. I do not know yet, Sarah said. I think perhaps all three, in different proportions depending on the day. He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then again, that almost smile. Honest, he said, with a quality that suggested he was noting it the way one notes something rare. I find that also tends to be unfashionable in courts. I have not had much opportunity to learn fashion, she said. Perhaps that is its own kind of advantage, he said. And then a council member appeared at the edge of the hall with an expression of barely contained urgency. And Kaelin rose. And the moment closed around itself like water over a stone, quiet and complete, leaving no visible trace of what had passed within it. He did not look back at her as he crossed the hall. He did not need to. Chaol did, though. The wolf turned his great silver head and held Sarah's gaze for one long, deliberate moment, and what she saw in those glacier eyes was something she did not have a word for yet. Something that felt like recognition. Something that felt like the beginning of a sentence that was going to take a very long time to finish. The days inside the castle had their own particular texture, cut off from the world by walls of snow that showed no sign of relenting. The storm did not rage so much as it persisted, a relentless, patient white curtain drawn against every window, pressing the castle's population into increasingly close quarters and correspondingly elevated tensions. Sarah had spent her life being good at navigating small spaces, at finding the angles and corners where she could exist without friction. But this was different. This confinement had a pressure to it that went beyond the physical, as if the storm had forced everyone's private calculations into the open, stripped away the polite distances that court life normally maintained between ambition and honesty. She had spent the morning of the second day in the library on the upper floor of the East Wing, which was technically accessible to all residents of the castle, but was rarely visited by anyone of sufficient rank to make Sarah's presence there a problem. She had been searching, without quite admitting to herself, that she was searching for anything she could find about unnatural storms and their origins in the history of Valthorn. What she found instead was a collection of sealed record boxes that had been pushed behind a bookshelf in the far corner of the room, dusty in a way that suggested they had been there for a very long time and had not been meaningfully disturbed in all that time. She would not have thought anything of them, except that one of the boxes had a mark on its side that she recognized. The mark of the Vallon family. Her family's mark. Her mother's family. The family that had sent her to Valthorn as a ward when she was 4 years old, too young to understand why, and too young to ask the questions that, as she grew older, began to feel increasingly important. She stood in front of the shelf for a long time, her hand resting on the mark, listening to the particular silence of an unoccupied room. Then she pulled the box out and sat down at the nearest table and opened it. The contents were dry and old, and smelled of aged parchment and something faintly metallic she could not identify. There were letters, bound with cord that had dried and cracked, written in formal script she had to read slowly and carefully. There were official documents bearing the seal of the crown, which struck her immediately as wrong, as something a private family archive should not contain. There were record pages from the pack registry, which was the formal documentation of each wolf's designation and bloodline, and when she found her own name in those pages, she stopped. The entry was straightforward on its surface. Sarah Vallon, female, born in the 23rd year of the current king's father's reign. Designation: Omega. But beside the designation, in smaller, cramped letters that looked like they had been added later by a different hand, were 4 words that her eyes read twice, 3 times, 4 times, before her mind accepted them. Designation suppressed by decree. Her hands were perfectly steady on the paper. She noticed that about herself. She had always had steady hands. Whatever her body felt, her hands tended to remain calm, which was perhaps why she had always been better at watching than reacting. She sat with those 4 words for a long time. The fire in the library grate burned slowly down. Outside, the snow continued its patient, patterned fall. Inside, Sarah sat with the slow, enormous understanding of something that had been true her entire life, and had been hidden from her by people who had decided, for reasons she did not yet know, that she was better off not knowing it. She did not know how long she sat there. She did not hear the door open. She did not hear footsteps, which should have been her first indication that whoever had entered the room was not an ordinary visitor. She became aware of a presence not through any of the normal sensory channels, but through a shift in the temperature of the air, a slight cooling that was not unpleasant, more like the feeling of stepping from a warm room into a hallway, where the air is cleaner and carries more information. She looked up, and Kyle was sitting 4 feet away, watching her with those pale silver-blue eyes that held, as always, more than she knew how to interpret. She looked at the wolf. She looked at the papers in her hands. She looked back at the wolf. "Did he send you?" she said. Kale blinked once, slowly, in a way that was not an answer, but was not a non-answer either. She set the papers down on the table carefully, keeping them in order. "I found something," she said, which was not a thing she had planned to say, was perhaps not a wise thing to say to a wolf who belonged to a king whose family seal appeared on documents she had no business finding. But the words came out with the same quality as everything she had said since this impossible snow had started. Steady and true, and without the performance of calculation. "I do not know what it means yet," she continued, "but I think it changes something." Kyle rose and padded to the table and looked at the papers. He did not touch them. He simply looked, and then he looked at her, and then he turned and walked to the door and stopped there and looked back at her again. She understood. She was not entirely sure how she understood, but she did. She gathered the papers and followed. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. He was in the council chamber on the 3rd floor, the one with the high windows that now showed nothing but white. He was alone, which was unusual, and he was standing at the window rather than at the table, which told her something about the quality of his thoughts in that moment. He turned when she entered, and his expression cycled through something very quickly, before settling into the stillness she was beginning to understand was not absence of feeling, but a very practiced form of containment. Kale went to him, and pressed his great pale head against the king's hand, and Kalen's fingers curled automatically through the wolf's fur. He looked at what Sarah was holding. "You have been in the archive," he said. It was not a question. His voice was neutral, but not empty. There was something underneath it that she could not read yet. "I found a box with my family's mark on it," she said. She set the papers on the council table and stepped back, giving him access to them without placing herself in the posture of someone presenting evidence or someone defending themselves, simply making the information available. He came to the table and looked at the documents, and she watched his face as he read, watched the small, controlled way his expression shifted at certain pages, and she thought about the fact that he was a man who had been trained from birth to keep his responses internal, to show the world only what he chose to show, and that even so, in this moment, she could read him. Not completely, not with certainty, but she could read the shape of what was moving behind his eyes. When he finished, he set the last page down and was quiet for a long time. "You were not supposed to find these," he said. "I know," she said. "Did you know what was in them?" she said. He looked at her. The directness was back, full and unguarded in a way she was not sure he intended. or perhaps was not sure he had the energy to prevent. "No," he said. "I knew a suppression had been ordered. I did not know it was you." She absorbed this. "What was I before the suppression?" she said. He was quiet for another moment. "The record is incomplete," he said. "But the bloodline listed in the original registry entry, before it was altered, indicates a designation of Sigma." Sarah had heard the word. She had encountered it in the very old texts, the ones that predated the current hierarchy classifications, that talked about the original pack structure before it had been formalized into the tiers, that everyone now accepted as natural and inevitable. Sigma was the old word, the word that had been removed from the official classifications 4 generations ago, supposedly because the designation had died out, supposedly because the bloodlines that carried it had thinned until they were no longer detectable. The word that, in the original texts, was defined not as a rank, but as a function, not a position in a hierarchy, but a source of something the early historians described in terms that sounded to a modern ear dangerously close to magic. "A Sigma has not existed in living memory," Sarah said. "No," Kaelin agreed. "They have not." He was watching her with the same quality of attention he had brought to the fireplace, to their first conversation, to every moment he had looked at her, which was the quality of someone paying the kind of attention that most people reserve for things they have already decided matter. "Why would my family suppress it?" she said. "The Velen family sat on the council 3 generations ago," he said. "They were removed when a vote went against them on a territorial question. A Sigma in the family would have given them more influence than the council was comfortable with at that time. It appears they were pressured to suppress the bloodline, rather than have it declared formally." Sarah looked at the papers. She looked at her hands, which were, as always, very steady. She thought about 4 years old. She thought about being sent away. She thought about a lifetime of being the least important person in every room, of developing the skill of watching because watching was all she had been given access to, of learning to read people and situations with a precision that she had always assumed was simply temperament, simply the personality she had built in the space she had been assigned. She thought about Kale lying down at her feet. She thought about the wolf choosing her in a room full of people with more power and more standing and more of everything that was supposed to matter. She thought about the look in his glacier eyes. And she understood, with the slow, enormous certainty of something that has always been true, finally being allowed to be said, that the wolf had not chosen her despite what she was. He had chosen her because of it. "The storm," she said. She looked at the king. "Does it have anything to do with this?" His jaw tightened fractionally. "I have been trying to understand the storm since it began," he said. "There are historical accounts of weather events tied to significant pack events. Arrivals. Awakenings." He paused on the last word in a way that placed a particular weight on it. "Awakenings," Sarah repeated. "There is a ritual," he said slowly, as if he was weighing each word as he offered it. "It is very old. It predates the current hierarchy system. It was used when a wolf came into their true designation later than expected, or when a suppressed designation needed to be formally restored. It requires specific conditions." He looked at the windows, at the relentless white pressing against the glass. "Some of those conditions appear to have arranged themselves," he said. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then, "The storm created the conditions. Or the conditions created the storm," he said. "Which came first is a question that may not have an answer, or may have an answer that is not comfortable to sit with." She understood that too. She was getting better at understanding things she could not fully articulate, as if some channel that had been blocked her entire life was slowly, incrementally opening. And the information that flowed through it arrived not as words or images, but as something more immediate and less arguable. She looked at Kale, who was sitting between them with his great pale head turning from one to the other with the alert, patient attention of a creature who had known how this was going to go and had simply been waiting for the humans to catch up. "What would the ritual require?" she said. Kaelin looked at her for a long moment. In his expression, She saw something she had not expected to see. Something she was not sure she had a name for yet. Something that lived in the same territory as the almost smile, but was deeper and more complicated, and considerably more vulnerable. Among other things, he said carefully, it requires the presence of a willing alpha. The word landed between them with a weight that the room seemed to physically absorb. Sarah held it. She held the weight of it, and the implications of it, and the particular quality of the way he had said willing, as if he needed her to understand that nothing about this was foregone, that the decision was hers to make, and the making of it would be respected regardless of what she chose. "Tell me everything," she said. The next several hours were some of the strangest and most clarifying of Sarah's life. They sat at the council table, she and Kaylin, with Kale between them and the old documents spread across the surface, and they went through everything. Not just the records she had found, but the ones he retrieved from a locked cabinet behind the tapestry on the north wall. The ones that turned out to be the companion set to hers. The pieces of the record that had been divided and stored separately, she suspected, so that no single person could ever put together the complete picture without the other half. The ritual itself was documented in a text that was older than the castle. A slim volume bound in something that was not leather and did not respond to fire, which the castle's library catalog listed under a classification that translated roughly from the old language as things that were before things. The ritual was not a ceremony in the formal sense. It was not a procedure with steps to be followed and outcomes to be guaranteed. It was more like an invitation, extended into whatever currents ran beneath the visible surface of pack law and history. An invitation for a suppressed truth to be acknowledged and restored. It required 3 things. The presence of a sigma, willing and aware. The presence of an alpha bonded to the sigma by genuine recognition, not political arrangement or formal selection, but the organic, uncoerced acknowledgement of something real. And the presence of a witness from the oldest bloodline connected to the pack. Kaylin had been quiet when he read that 3rd requirement, and Sarah had watched him be quiet, and had waited. And after a moment he had said, "Kale is that witness," with the tone of someone confirming something they had suspected, but had not allowed themselves to assume. The wolf had made a sound at that, low and vibrating and deeply settled, the sound of something being recognized accurately. They had not discussed the 2nd requirement explicitly. They had both read it, and both understood it, and both elected, in the wordless agreement of 2 people who were still figuring out the precise shape of what existed between them, not to push the articulation further than the text required. The recognition, the genuine and uncoerced recognition, was already present. It had been present since the fireplace. Possibly it had been present before that, in the mechanisms that had arranged Sarah's arrival in this castle as a child, in the bloodline history that connected her family's story to the history of Valthorn, in ways that were only now becoming visible. Some things, Sarah was beginning to understand, do not arrive by accident. The ritual would take place the following morning, before the storm cleared. The storm would clear when the ritual was complete, or so the old text implied in the circuitous, suggestion-heavy way that very old wisdom tended to communicate when it did not want to be reduced to instruction. They parted at the door of the council chamber, Sarah to her room in the east wing, Kaylin to wherever kings go when they are not being watched, to whatever private space held the things they did not show the court. At the door, he paused with his hand on the frame and looked at her, and the quality of that look was one she tucked carefully into the interior of herself, not to be analyzed yet, but to be kept intact until she had the proper distance from which to see it clearly. "Try to sleep," he said. "I rarely sleep well in castles," she said. "Neither do I," he said. And he was gone, and Kale went with him, and Sarah walked back to her room through corridors that were quiet with the specific quality of a world holding its breath. She did not sleep well. She had not expected to. She lay on the narrow bed with the snow pressing against the exterior shutters, and thought about designation and suppression and the kind of inheritance that is not material, but carried in the blood, in the deepest layers of whatever a person is, before they learn what they are supposed to be. She thought about her mother, who had died when Sarah was 2 years old. Young enough. That memory and imagination were hopelessly mixed. She thought about Kaylin's wife, the mate who had died in a border conflict 3 years into the reign, the grief that had closed something in the king that had never quite reopened. She wondered what it had cost him to sit beside her at the fireplace. She wondered what it had cost him to retrieve those documents and look at her with that particular quality of attention while they reconstructed the hidden history that connected their lives. She wondered a great many things in the dark, and eventually, somewhere in the small hours of the morning, she stopped wondering and simply felt the truth of what she knew. She was not who she had been told she was. She had never been who she had been told she was. And that was not, it turned out, a source of grief. It was a source of something much more useful, something she could feel beginning to move in the deeper places of herself, slow and warm, and very sure of its own direction. Morning arrived with the particular quality that mornings have when something significant is going to happen in them. The light coming through the shutters was different, not the flat white of a storm-filtered day, but something with more texture to it. The snow had not stopped, but she could tell, in some way she could not have explained, that it would stop. She dressed carefully. She did not have court clothes, had never needed them, had spent her years in the castle in the plain, serviceable garments of someone whose function was to be present, but not visible. She chose the best of what she had, a deep gray dress that was simple but well made, and she did her hair as neatly as she could manage, and she looked at herself in the small metal mirror above the wash basin and tried to see what Kyle had seen when he crossed a room full of important people and lay down at her feet. She was not sure she could see it yet, but she believed it was there. Belief, she was learning, was often the bridge between what you could see and what was real. She found Kaylin in the great hall. He was standing near the center fireplace, the large one, the one that everyone used rather than the small one by the column where they had first sat together. And the hall was quiet this early, most of its involuntary residents still sleeping or breaking their fast in the smaller rooms adjacent to the kitchens. He turned when she entered, and the look on his face was one she filed alongside the one from the night before, for later, for when she had the perspective to examine it properly. He was dressed in the formal colors of the House of Ashvale, deep charcoal and silver, and the formality of it struck her differently than usual. Usually formal dress on powerful people read to her as armor, as the performance of authority. On him this morning it read as something else, as an acknowledgement that what was about to happen mattered enough to be treated with the seriousness it deserved. Kyle was at his side. The wolf looked at Sarah when she entered and made that low, resonant sound again, the one that lived below the register of normal hearing and was felt rather than heard, and Sarah felt it move through her this time with a clarity that stopped her breath for a moment. Something was different this morning. Not in the room, in herself. She stood in the center of the great hall and felt the difference, the way you feel the change in air pressure before a storm breaks. Except this was interior, a shift in the pressure of something she had been living under her entire life without having a name for. "You feel it," Kaylin said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. She looked at her hands. They were steady, as always. But there was something in them this morning that was not usually there. A faint warmth beneath the skin that was not the warmth of temperature, but of something moving. Of something that had been still for a very long time beginning to wake. "The ritual begins when you are ready," he said. She looked at him. He was watching her with that steady, deep attention, and in his eyes she could see both the gravity of the moment and something else. Something that was not gravity. Something that was much warmer than gravity, and considerably more personal. And she understood that he was not watching the Sigma designation being restored. He was watching her. Specifically her. Sarah Vallin, who had sat by a fire with her hands open and not moved when everything in her training said to move, who had stayed still and been found, who had spent a lifetime watching, and was only now beginning to understand what all that watching had been for. "I am ready," she said. The ritual, as described in the old text, was not dramatic in the conventional sense, There were no spoken incantations, no components to be gathered or circles to be drawn. It was, in its essence, an act of acknowledgement, a deliberate and witnessed choice by all three parties present to be exactly what they were and to name it without flinching. Sarah stood in the center of the great hall, and Cale stood beside her, and the wolf turned his great silver head upward and made a sound she had not heard before, something older than a howl and more complex, a sound that vibrated in the stone of the walls and in the deep architecture of Sarah's own bones. She felt the answer to it come from inside her, before she had any conscious thought of producing it. Her wolf, which she had never known she had, which had been sealed behind that decree her entire life, heard the call of the oldest blood in Valthorn, and answered. It was not a physical transformation. Nothing in her body shifted in the visible, dramatic way that full shifts did. It was subtler and deeper, a kind of unlocking, a door opening in the interior of herself that she had not known was closed, because she had never in her life been on the other side of it to feel the difference. But the difference was enormous. It arrived all at once, and she held it, held the sudden fullness of it, the sense of being completely herself for the first time, of having access to all the rooms of her own interior rather than only the few that had been left open to her. The warmth in her hands spread through her entire body. Cale pressed his head against her leg with a gentleness that was also an acknowledgement, and she felt his ancient bloodline recognizing hers, felt the witness of it, and her eyes were burning, but she was not going to cry. Not yet. After. Kaelin had been watching the whole time, standing a few feet to her left, and when it was over, when the quality of the air in the hall settled into the new thing it had become, when the warmth in Sarah's chest was steady and certain rather than surging, he closed the distance between them. He stood in front of her, close enough that she could see the very specific thing happening in his gray eyes, and he said, very quietly, Sarah, just her name, just that. But the way he said it carried the weight of everything they had not yet said, everything that was still in the process of becoming speakable. And she felt it in all the new places in herself that were open now, felt it with a clarity and a depth that she could not have accessed 2 days ago. I want to say something to you, he said. I know that you have just received an enormous amount of information about yourself, and I know that this is not the moment for anything additional to be placed on you. But I want to say it. Before the court wakes up and this room fills with people and the world reasserts all its complications, because I have spent 3 years not saying things that deserve to be said, and I do not want to do that anymore. He paused. He was not a man who paused, she had noticed. He was a man who spoke with precision and intention, and without the hedging hesitations that uncertainty produced. That he paused told her something. Kyle has not gone to anyone in 3 years, he said. I have been asked, many times why, and I have told people that he is particular, and that his bond is old, and that the designation of a spirit wolf is not ours to command. All of which is true. But what is also true is that I watched him every day for 3 years, looking for something I could not see, and that the morning he found you, the morning he came back to this hall and lay down at your feet, was the first morning in 3 years that I understood what he had been looking for. The burning in her eyes was becoming a problem. You, she said. It was not a declaration so much as a confirmation of something they both already knew, and she was simply naming for the record. Yes, he said. Me. His hand came up slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back if she wanted to, and he touched her face with the same deliberateness that his wolf moved with, the deliberateness of something that has made a decision and is not in a hurry to take it back. I am not asking for an answer today, he said. I'm only saying that what began at that fireplace, for me, is not something I am inclined to walk away from. When you are ready to know what it is, I will be here. She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the man who had lost his mate and closed himself away from warmth and had spent 3 years sitting with a wolf who could see something in the world that he was still waiting to understand. She looked at the specific quality of patience in his face, the patience of someone who had learned through grief that things happen in their own time, and that forcing them produces outcomes that are technically outcomes, but are not what you actually wanted. "I do not need more time," she said. "I have had enough time. I have been watching and waiting for longer than I knew, and I know what I know. I know what I feel when you look at me. I know what Cale knew when he lay down at my feet." She held his gaze. She held it with all of herself, with all the new rooms in herself that were open now, with all the depth she had spent a lifetime developing through watching, because watching was all she had been permitted to do. "I know what this is," she said. He looked at her with those gray eyes that held everything he had taught himself not to show, and then he leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers, and they stayed like that for a long moment, foreheads touching, the warmth between them as steady and deep as the fire that had started all of this, as old and patient, as the blood that Cale had recognized in her, before either of them had words for what they were recognizing. Outside, the snow stopped. The change was audible. The persistent, low-level sound of wind and falling snow that had been the constant underscore of 3 days of confinement simply ceased, all at once, between one breath and the next. In the silence that followed, the castle itself seemed to expand slightly, as if it had been held at tension and was now releasing. Sarah and Kaelin stepped, apart by a fraction, and both of them looked toward the high windows of the Great Hall, where the white curtain had fallen away, to reveal a sky that was the clear, cold blue of early morning after a storm. The light that came through the glass was different from any light that had entered the hall in 3 days. It was sharp and clean and full of information, the kind of light that shows you what things actually are, rather than what you have been assuming them to be. They were not alone much longer. The castle woke with a different quality than it had on the previous 3 mornings. The sounds of people moving through corridors carrying a note of relief and animation that the confinement had suppressed. Within half an hour, the Great Hall had filled with the nobility and council members who had been waiting out the storm, and the air was full of the complicated social music of people recalibrating their positions and their plans and their understandings of what had happened during the days in which normal movement had been suspended. Isolde arrived precisely 12 minutes after the first cluster of nobles. Sarah counted, because she was someone who noticed patterns, and the interval was precise enough to suggest calculation rather than coincidence. The arrival time to be neither too early, which would have suggested urgency, nor too late, which would have suggested uncertainty. She entered from the east corridor, dressed in a deep emerald green that made her dark hair and pale eyes look almost supernatural, and she crossed the hall with the grace of a woman who was absolutely certain of her right to be wherever she was going. She stopped when she saw Sarah standing beside Kaelin. She stopped, and for a single unguarded second, the precise calculation in her face broke apart and showed what was underneath it, which was not anger, not precisely, but the particular, devastating shock of a person who had built a very careful structure and has just watched the foundation shift. It lasted 1 second. Then it was gone, replaced by the control she had been refining her whole life, and her expression rearranged itself into something that managed to be both composed and watchful. She looked at Kyle, who was sitting at Sarah's left side, and at whatever she saw in the wolf's posture and positioning, something she had enough knowledge of pack lore to read. Something shifted again in her face, deeper this time, and harder to conceal. The council member who had appeared the previous evening materialized beside Kaelin with a question about the road clearance and the timeline for resuming travel, and Kaelin answered him without looking away from Sarah for longer than the conversation required, and in the way he reoriented back to her after each necessary diversion, Sarah read something that the court would have read as well, had they been paying the right kind of attention. Several of them were. She could feel the quality of observation shift in the room. The way it had shifted the morning Cale chose her, but deeper now, and with more information, and with the specific weight that significant political developments tend to carry in environments where politics is the air everyone breathes. One of the older council members approached. She was a woman in her 60s, with the careful eyes of someone who had navigated many courts and many eras of power. And she looked at Sarah with an assessment that was thorough and unhurried. I do not believe we have been formally introduced, the council member said. I am Elder Voss, and I would very much like to know who you are. Sarah held the older woman's gaze with the steadiness she had always had, and the fullness she had only just come into. And she felt Kaylin beside her, and Kyle at her left, and the warmth in her own chest that was hers now, reclaimed and restored, and entirely her own. I am Sarah Vallon, she said. I am a Sigma, the first in 4 generations, and I have been living in the East Wing of this castle for 21 years. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it, the kind that attaches itself to moments that are going to be referenced later, that people will say they were in the room for, that will become the fixed point around which subsequent events will arrange themselves. Elder Voss looked at Kale. She looked at Kaylin. She looked at Sarah. And then, slowly, with the gravity and the grace of a woman who has spent a long career knowing when a thing is real, and when a thing is performed, she inclined her head. Then Valthorn is fortunate that the storm kept us all indoors, she said, and that you knew how to sit still at a fire. There was a ripple through the assembled court, the specific social oscillation that groups produce when a new alignment has been publicly acknowledged, and everyone is in the process of recalculating. Sarah felt it move through the room like a wave. She stood in the middle of it and let it pass, and she thought about all the years she had spent on the edges of rooms watching waves like this one and thinking they had nothing to do with her. She had been wrong. She had been wrong about so many things, and she was going to spend a very long time learning the texture of that wrongness, the shape of who she actually was, and what that meant for the shape of her life going forward. But for now, in this moment, in this hall, with the light coming clean and sharp through the windows, and the wolf warm beside her, and the king's shoulder a specific, deliberate distance from hers, she was exactly who she was. For the first time. And it was enough. More than enough. It was the beginning of everything. The weeks that followed the lifting of the storm were not simple. Sarah had not expected them to be. The restoration of her designation was not a resolution, but a beginning. And beginnings of the kind that shake the architecture of existing power structures tend to generate considerable friction before they find their equilibrium. Isolde's response was predictable in its outline and surprising in its precision. Too intelligent to mount an open challenge, she conducted instead a quiet, methodical campaign of insinuation, spreading through the court's informal networks the suggestion that the documentation had been falsified, that the Sigma designation had been retired for a reason, that the events of the storm had been manufactured, that the king's proximity to Sarah was the result of manipulation rather than genuine recognition. None of these suggestions were made loudly. None of them were directly attributable. They moved through the court the way water moves through stone, finding the cracks, the small existing fault lines of skepticism and self-interest. Sarah watched it happen with the same attention she had brought to everything in this castle, patient and precise. She did not ignore it. She did not dismiss it. She also did not panic, which several people seemed to be waiting for her to do. Kaylin was aware of the campaign. He mentioned it to her once, precisely, with the directness she was coming to understand, was simply how he communicated when the topic was one he was treating seriously. Isolde is suggesting that the documentation is false, he said. They were in the library, sitting at the same table where she had found the records, with Kale between them and the afternoon light coming through the window at an angle that turned the dust motes in the air into small suspended stars. I know, Sarah said. Are you concerned? He said. She considered the question honestly. I am watching, she said. I have spent my life watching. I know how these campaigns work. I know what feeds them and what starves them. He looked at her in that steady way. What starves them? He said. Truth, stated plainly and without defensiveness, she said. And time. Insinuation cannot survive sustained proximity to the thing it is trying to misrepresent. Eventually, people look at the actual thing and stop looking at the story. He was quiet for a moment. You are not afraid, he said. It was half observation, half question. The kind of statement that is also an invitation. "I was afraid for most of my life," she said. "I was afraid in the very specific way that people are afraid when they do not know what they are, when they have been told they are less than they are, and they cannot find the evidence to argue against it because the evidence has been hidden from them. That kind of fear is very quiet and very constant, and exhausts you in ways you do not notice until it stops." She looked at her hands on the table, which were steady, as always. "It has stopped," she said. "I am not sure I have the proper words for what has replaced it yet, but it does not feel like fear." He reached across the table and covered her hands with his, and she turned her palms upward and felt the particular warmth of his touch, the alpha warmth that was different from ordinary human warmth, that carried something within it that spoke to something within her in the language that designations speak when they recognize their complement. They sat like that for a long time, with the dust motes drifting in the afternoon light and Kyle breathing between them, and the world outside the library window going on with all its friction and its politics and its management of change. And inside, the two of them simply present with each other in the way that was becoming, incrementally, and then all at once, the most natural thing in either of their lives. The formal council session happened on the 9th day after the storm. It was called by Elder Voss, and her decision to formally convene communicated without words that she had concluded the question of Sarah's designation was real and deserved formal treatment. The session was held in the great council chamber on the 2nd floor, with the long table and the seats arranged in the old hierarchy order. The arrangement did not include a seat for Sigma, because no Sigma had attended a council session in 4 generations. Kalen had arrived before her. He was seated at the head of the table, and his expression as she entered was the carefully controlled attention that she had come to understand was how he looked when he was keeping something contained. He gestured to the chair at his immediate right, the place that had been formally empty since his mate's death, and the gesture communicated an enormous volume of information to everyone in the room. Sarah sat. Kyle arranged himself between their chairs. The council session began. Elder Voss presented the documentation methodically. She had spent the preceding days consulting with the kingdom's archive keepers and with the oldest of the pack historians, and the case she presented was thorough and specific and left very little in the way of structural gaps for insinuation to occupy. The bloodline evidence was verified independently by 3 separate historians. The suppression decree was confirmed against the original council records from 4 generations ago, which showed not only the existence of the order, but the political context that had produced it. The Sigma designation itself was presented with historical documentation covering its characteristics, its historical rarity, and the circumstances under which it had been systematically eliminated from the official classification system, which Elder Voss described with the measured precision of a woman who has earned the right to say difficult things simply, as a political act with a historical weight that this council was now in a position to address. Isolde spoke once. She raised the question of verification with a specificity and a technical precision that demonstrated she had prepared, and Elder Voss answered with equal specificity. And after the response, there was a silence in which Isolde's face showed, briefly, the recalibration that Sarah had seen in the great hall on the first morning, and then it smoothed again into the composed, watchful expression that seemed to be her default. No one seconded Isolde's concern, not even Petra, who was seated in the outer ring, and who looked at the table in front of her with the careful attention of someone who has just completed a new calculation. The vote, when it came, was not unanimous. 3 council members abstained, but the remaining 7 voted to formally restore the Sigma designation to the active classification system and to recognize Sarah's bloodline claim. When the final count was read aloud, the quality of the silence in the chamber was different from the silence that had followed her name in the great hall 9 days ago. That silence had been the silence of shock. This silence was the silence of something settling, the particular quality of a structure that has shifted and is now finding its new equilibrium, a sound that is not quite sound, but is felt in the chest, in the bones, in the deep inherited instinct of pack animals who have always been able to sense when a change in alignment has become permanent. Kalen looked at her after the final count was read. He did not speak, because this was not the moment for speech. This was the moment for the kind of communication that does not require words, and his gray eyes held everything she needed to see. The satisfaction and the relief, and the specific, careful warmth that he was still learning to let her witness without containing it, because he was a man who had sealed himself away from the cost of warmth for 3 years and was relearning, incrementally and sometimes painfully, that the cost was worth the paying. She looked back at him with equal fullness, because she was a woman who had been practicing the art of seeing clearly her entire life, had been developing that capacity in the only space she had been given, and she could afford now to let what she saw in him be seen. Cale made the sound, the old one, the one from the ritual, deep and resonant and felt in the architecture of the room. Several of the council members looked at the wolf with expressions that ranged from awe to something close to tears. The sound of the spirit wolf was something that most of them had read about in history texts and had never expected to hear in their lifetimes, had never expected to be present for, and the weight of being present for it was visible on their faces. Elder Voss was one of the ones who looked like she might cry. She did not, but it was close. "The session is concluded," she said, in a voice that was perfectly steady, except for the single low note at the end of concluded that gave away what she was containing. "Valthorn has its Sigma. May she serve this kingdom well." Sarah thought about all the years she had spent in the East Wing. She thought about all the rooms she had not been permitted to enter, and all the conversations she had not been included in, and all the times she had made herself smaller to fit into the space she had been given. She thought about sitting by the fire in a gray shawl, and the wolf crossing the room, and the king sitting down beside her on a servant's bench, and the snow and the records and the ritual, and the morning after, when everything had been different and the same simultaneously, different in all the structural ways, and the same in the ways that had always been true, the ways that a decree could suppress but could not erase, that had been living in her blood and in her hands, in the steadiness of them the whole time. "I will," she said. And she meant it with all of herself. All of the rooms, all of the things she was, finally, permitted to be. The seasons changed after that. Valthorn in its winter was beautiful in a way that Sarah had never had the space to properly notice. The mountains white and sharp against the northern sky, the forests deep and still, the castle itself taking on a different quality under the snow, warmer somehow despite the cold. More itself, as if the season stripped away the performance of the place and showed what it actually was beneath the formal surfaces. She learned the castle differently in those months, not as a resident finding her corners and her angles of invisibility, but as someone who had been acknowledged, and whose acknowledgement changed the way space opened up around her. Doors that had been metaphorically closed were now physically open. Conversations that had been conducted around her were now conducted with her. People she had known only as figures she navigated around began to have textures and histories, and the specific kind of interest that came with being seen as a person worth knowing rather than an obstacle worth managing. It was not without its frictions. There were still those who regarded her designation with a skepticism that had calcified into something closer to principle, who had built enough of their understanding of the world around a hierarchy that did not include a sigma that the inclusion felt like a threat rather than a correction. She was patient with this. She had always been patient. Patience had been the only tool she was given for most of her life, and she had refined it to a quality that served her now in ways she had not anticipated. Isolde was not one of the ones who came around. Sarah had not expected her to. She watched with the same attention she brought to everything, and she thought that perhaps what Isolde needed was not defeat, but a different direction for the things. She was a different set of problems that were actually worth the quality of her intelligence, and that this was, in the end, Valthorn's problem to solve, and not hers. Calen knew she was watching. He knew most things that she was paying attention to, because they had fallen into the habit of talking in the evenings, in the library, or in the small sitting room adjacent to the main hall, not about politics or strategy in any formal sense, but about what they had observed during the day, what they had noticed, what patterns they were beginning to see in the recovery of the kingdom. He was a good talker, it turned out, when he trusted his listener enough to say things that were still forming, rather than things that had already been polished. She had not expected that. She had expected precision, and she had found precision, but she had also found beneath it an actual quality of curiosity about the world, something that had been sealed beneath the grief and the kingship and the demands of being a man whose every word had consequence. The mate bond was not a thing that arrived all at once. What it was, in her experience, was more like the tide, something that was always in motion, that advanced and receded and advanced further, shaped by the specific shoreline it encountered. She felt it in the way she could tell, from across a room, what quality of thought he was having. She felt it in the way that his attention carried a warmth that was not just temperature, but depth. The depth of someone who has decided that the person they are looking at is worth all the space their looking takes up. She felt it in Kyle, who moved between them now, with the easy certainty of a creature who has found what he was looking for and does not need to search anymore. The formal acknowledging of the bond came in the spring. It was evening, in the library, with Kale asleep on the hearthrug, and the last of the winter light coming through the windows in long, low bars of gold. And there had been a pause in their conversation, and in the pause Kaelin had looked at her with the specific quality of attention that she now knew was his version of saying everything he had not yet said, and she had looked back with the same, and between the looking and the being looked at, between the knowing and the being known, something settled. Something that had been in motion became still. Something that had been becoming arrived. He reached across the table and she took his hand, and the warmth that moved between them was not the warmth of potential or proximity or growing recognition. It was the warmth of something complete. The wolf opened his silver eyes and looked at them both, and made the sound, the old and resonant sound, the one that lived below the register of ordinary hearing and was felt in the chest, in the bones, in the deep inherited knowledge of what pack means when it means its truest thing. The sound did not echo in the room. It settled into the room, the way warmth settles, the way right things settle when they finally come to rest. Outside, the spring was beginning. The forests were coming back into green. The roads were open, and the kingdom was doing what kingdoms do after long winters, which is to shake itself out and remember what it was before it was cold. Inside the library, Sarah and Kaelin sat with their hands joined across the old table, and the wolf breathed deep and slow on the hearthrug, and the bond between them sat warm and certain, and entirely at rest, in the space between them. She was Sarah Valine. She was a Sigma, the first in 4 generations. She was the king's mate. She was the wolf's chosen. She was exactly herself, and the world of Valthorn was very slowly, very surely, rearranging itself around the fact of her. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming?